Hey everyone. Today's episode is brought to you by a friend of the show, Lane Campbell, a trusted mortgage loan originator who helps families just like yours. If you're thinking about buying a home, refinancing, or just exploring your options, Lane will walk with you every step of the way. Serving North Carolina, Virginia, and Florida, Lane takes the stress out of the mortgage process so you can focus on what matters most, whether it's using your home equity to get money for home improvements or debt consolidation or finding the right loan for your first home. Lane is ready to serve and answer any questions. Call or text him at 618 671 1830 and get the mortgage advice you need. That's 618 671 1830. AFMA Mortgage Services LLC. That's AAFMAA Mortgage Services. NMLS number 2413537. Equal housing lender. For licensing and legal disclaimers, visit amshomeloans.com. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome, or good evening, I should say, and welcome to the Particular Baptist Podcast. I am your host, Daniel Vincent. You can find us and other podcasts at reformpodcast.com. Also, check out our blog at theparticularbaptist.net. If you click on the QR code, not click on, but scan the QR code, you can get to it there. Also, if you would like to join our army of patrons, you can do so by going to this QR code right there. Still trying to figure this out. You can get to the QR code and join our army of patrons, get extra stuff. Patreon.com, the Particular Baptist. All righty. So we have an interesting show today, and I'm in a different part of the house. Wanted a change of scenery this time. I just got home from work not too long ago. You got the beautiful fall weather in the back of the sunset in the mountains. It's a beautiful setting. Works well for what we want to do. But Lord willing, next week we'll be back in the basement with the cool book and things like that. So we'll see how that works. But today we're going to be talking about the crown. Oh, the British crown, that pesky British crown. Us as Americans are always, for some reason, I think we're still kind of fascinated by the crown. American entertainment loves to glamorize British monarchy. There's been some really interesting and good entertainment put out on that. But I do think we obsess over it too much. And we forget where we came from as Americans, that our roots are. And I think we get a little distracted. And it's like, no, we don't want to go back to that. We don't want to go back to the crown. We don't want to go back to living in that kind of under any tyranny like that. But here we are. But, they continue to give us plenty to shoot at and shoot down. So, we're going to poke at King Charles III today a bit. This week, I think it was this week, it was announced that the king would be alongside the Pope. I'm pulling up an article here. This is from the Catholic Herald. Excuse me, I'll share my screen here so we can take a look at this. If it will let me. There we go. Yes. Whoa. Okay. So we have the King Charles and Pope Leo the historic first since 1534. This was from an article from the 18th. So like 5 days ago? He will next week become the British monarch since the Reformation to pray publicly with the Pope. He visits the Vatican for an official visit with Queen. The royal couple will meet Pope Leo the Apostolic Palace on Thursday, 23rd of October, which is today. So this happened already, I believe. I know I saw something about the King and Queen meeting with the Pope today, so this should have happened already. And it's an ecumenical service in the Sistine Chapel where they will pray together beneath Michelangelo's ceiling in a gesture meant to symbolize 5 centuries of progress toward Christian reconciliation. And, this is interesting too because of how long it's been since you had Britain being part of, or at least being unified with the Roman Catholic Church. It says 1534. And of course, this is when Henry VIII broke off the relationship completely, starting his own church and breaking off with Rome. During the visit, the king will also be made a royal comforter of the Abbey of St. Paul's outside, one of the 4 papal basilicas of Rome. The honorary title, approved by Pope Leo, carries no duties but acknowledges the king's personal efforts to promote unity among Christians. So this is one big, and it says here even at the praying together is likely to stand as a quiet but unmistakable sign of healing and of the shared spiritual concerns that now unite 2 representatives of kingdom and church. So we're talking about, if I can, there we go. So what we're talking about here is the King of England visiting with the Pope and praying with him, since this has not happened in the British monarchy since 1534. In 1534. And what's interesting about this, and one of the things that I think prompted me, or made me want to talk about this a bit more, was the fact that there's only been 3 Charleses in England. Of course, this is the 3rd Charles. The first 2 were in the 17th century during the Post-Reformation, and we'll get to some of the relevance of that here in a minute. But it's interesting. You only have 3 Charleses in all of England, and all 3 of them are sympathetic, or were and are sympathetic toward Rome. I found that very interesting as it relates to diving into this and looking at the history surrounding this lineage of Charles, right, in England. They've all been sympathetic toward Rome in one way or another. Now, of course, they're not the only ones in the British royal family to have been sympathetic toward Rome. Like you have, I believe, Bloody Mary, very much a Roman Catholic. You have James, who is the brother of Charles II, who was a Roman Catholic. Though the royal family has had Roman Catholic influence, and of course, before the Church of England, everybody was a Roman Catholic, of course, at least to some extent. So you have this, I guess, remnant of Roman Catholicism within the monarchy, even after its break with Rome in the 16th century. So that really never died off just because they were, not part of the Church of Rome anymore. So, but it's very interesting. What are the chances that 3 kings over the span of hundreds of years would have Roman sympathies? And this is post break from Rome, right? This is maybe about 100 years or so after the break with Rome. In England, you still have these kings who have the namesake of Charles in England having some kind of sympathy toward Rome, even if they aren't themselves devout Roman Catholics. It's just very interesting. And they all have similar ways in which they leverage Rome, as we're going to see in a minute. I'm going to do a little bit of a historical sketch here to kind of go through. There are some significance significant things here as it relates to the Charleses in relation to Reformed history. I think one thing that tends to happen when we're talking about Reformed history, and maybe even history in general, but church history in particular, I think there tends to be a disconnect with the context of what's going on around these great men, or even great that are happening, but that are related to church history. I think sometimes we forget. It's easy to look at the political strife and the things surrounding church history in the early church just because of how integrated the church was with state and how those things could not be separated. Now, of course, in England, you do have that, but I think looking through our modern eyes, I think there might be a tendency to think of that time period as more modern and maybe people being a little bit more disconnected from the world around them, especially when you're talking about the particular Baptists. Particular Baptists were more of, they were not for an established church. They had some semblance of uh, the government enforcing the first and second tables of the law, more of a disconnect, and you would find someone who is part of the Church of England who would see that as critical to state rule and what it means to be a God ordained government. And so you have this mindset, I think, where we can disconnect, unfortunately, the political sphere from what's going on. So, it is interesting to think about this thing. And I think, again, with particular Baptists, we forget about these events that were going on at the time. So when you're looking at Charles I, Charles II, these kings span critical time during the rise and I guess sustenance of the particular Baptist to some extent. There's overlap there with Charles I and Charles II. And of course, Charles III is modern day, and that's really not a problem anymore. But you do see this. Now, I want to look a minute at some of the sympathies that each of these men have, and then look at some lessons from this and kind of, bring it home from there. Not a super long episode today, but it's just interesting with this again, the Charles III wanting to pray with the Pontiff of Rome, being sympathetic like his two previous predecessors were, using the Roman Catholic Church to political ends. Really, that's what it is at the end of the day. It's political. It's a political maneuver. So, I think that's important to keep in mind. But if we're looking at Charles I, so Charles I was pretty early on in the 17th century. You do see him being very sympathetic toward Roman Catholicism, primarily because he married a Roman Catholic from France. And this is when people got married in royalty back then, it wasn't necessarily for love. Okay. We're talking about kings who have to keep the peace and prevent war. And one way to do that is to marry a country that marry into friendship with a country that you may not be great with on the surface, but if your daughter is married to the king of England, you're probably less likely to go and attack England because your daughter's there. It creates this bond in family that you probably wouldn't have otherwise, right? And so he marries this woman who's a Roman Catholic, and he may very well have loved her, but there was probably political influence there too. So he marries someone in France, and then secretly behind Parliament's back, he secretly promised King Louis of France that he would be more tolerant toward Roman Catholics while at the same time, and out of the other side of his mouth, promising Parliament that wouldn't happen. And Parliament didn't like the fact that he was marrying a Roman Catholic. And he's like, and they wanted him to make sure that he was not going to be lenient toward Roman Catholics in England because he was marrying a Roman Catholic. And he's like, no, 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 I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. I just want to marry her, blah, blah, blah. But unbeknownst to Parliament, he was secretly working with King Louis of France to be more tolerant of Roman Catholics in England. So you see this social structure start to break. Roman Catholicism was seen as wicked, evil. We shouldn't be part of this, shouldn't be engaging in this. And now for political reasons, he's trying to allow Catholicism to have a foothold in England. And of course, he has to do this secretly because, Parliament is certainly not going to be on board with this. So you see these strong sympathies, but they're not out of a conviction of Roman Catholicism. And up until as I was studying this, I thought that Charles I was a Roman Catholic, and he wasn't. He wasn't a Roman Catholic. He just was very sympathetic because he was married into one. He was married in Roman Catholic culture with France, and used the Rome for his ends. And that's really what it was, at least with these connivings. It was political power, political ends, selfish ambition, using Roman Catholicism as leverage to get what he wanted. Okay. So you have this, another thing too, it's kind of ironic, agreement that he had with France too, was to provide forces that the French would use against the French Huguenots, which was because remember the French Huguenots, they were basically French Reformed, and they were being persecuted in France, and France wanted to crush them, obviously being a Roman Catholic country. So you have this Protestant king who is sending forces, sending help to France to be used to crush Protestant resistance. Very ironic, but it just shows you how far Charles I was willing to go to get what he wanted. All right. So you have these Roman Catholic sympathies here. And then, you have Charles I. This is where you see Oliver Cromwell come on the scene, that Puritan leader who, would eventually work toward having Charles killed, executed, and becoming Lord Protector of England. But of course, you had Civil War. Charles had to deal with that quite a bit. And then in 1646, the First Civil War ended. And what's interesting about this is the same year the Westminster Confession was completed. So while all this war was going on, and while all this conniving with Charles, working with Roman Catholics and trying to establish those things, the Reformed Christians were working on, revising the Church of England, essentially trying to rebuild it to some extent. And then you also have particular Baptists who were working at that time too to revitalize or to make more popular their own understanding of the scriptures. In 1644, the first London Baptist Confession of Faith come on the scene. And, there was religious infighting among the Reformed, and of course, religious infighting between Parliament, Charles I. So there was war going on. There was these Baptists coming on the scene that people were like, what in the world are these people doing? And you just have all this civil unrest, right? A lot of it surrounding religious differences and religious struggle. So there is this, Charles I's reign was just a very tumultuous one. It wasn't a peaceful one, really. He was very much in a place that was not good in terms of the country. But you do see these things start to come out. The Baptists come on the scene. They start to, they're trying to make themselves relevant, right? And then you have Charles II. So Charles I was executed in, um, I believe, it was the early 1650s. Cromwell comes on the scene. Cromwell reigns, I think, for about 10 years. He passes away. His son takes over for a little bit, but it doesn't work out. And then you kind of have this strict power vacuum where there was no one to rule. And then Charles was in exile, or he was living in exile at least. And then he becomes king, I believe, in 1661. Now, for our Baptist fathers, it's interesting to see this because there were two declarations that came out, one in 1659 and one in 1659 declaration by Baptists. We've talked about this on the show before, and we have an article written that goes into detail on this that Brother Andrew Warwick dealt with, or wrote. But it's very interesting to kind of see what was going on with our Baptist forefathers. Our Baptist forefathers were dealing with pressure from the government because they were not tolerated, at least not, at least, to a great extent they weren't. But I think you see the timing of these declarations come out because they want to align themselves with the right side. Remember, 1659, I think 1658, Cromwell died. 1659 comes around, there's political unrest. You don't want to, whoever comes into power, you don't want them to think you're on the losing side, right? So you put out declarations to say, hey, this is where we stand on political issues. And this had to do with, we don't like Roman Catholics. We don't think that blasphemy should be tolerated. Basically, things that the government should enforce. And where are they aligning themselves? Trying to be very clear on a religious stance, where they align themselves in terms of the government's job as it relates to punishing blasphemy and things like that. And then 1660, right before Charles II comes on the scene, you have these Baptists own the 1659 by signing the 1660, saying, yeah, that's our document. They basically quote from it. They take a major quote from it. I think they quote from the First London Baptist Confession of Faith. They're owning it. They're saying this is ours, right? They're owning what it says, and all those things. So again, you see this discussion about what it means to for a government and to act in religious matters. As well as the first and second table of the law, more the first table of the law than anything else. And there's kind of a power vacuum during this time, or at least unrest. And so I don't think it's an accident that these things come on the scene. And Charles comes on the scene. You had Charles I, who was definitely favorable towards Roman Catholics, the Baptists. No. We don't want to be part of that. We don't identify with that. Roman Catholics should be suppressed, right? And then you have this power vacuum, and you have Charles come on the scene, Charles II come on the scene. And the Baptists, I think, have pretty much established themselves where they are at that time. But you can see how the sympathies toward Roman Catholicism in these, at least in Charles I, the effect that it had on the surrounding religious community. Obviously, Parliament didn't like that. Parliament represents the people. So there is this sense where their sentiment is the people's sentiment, right? So it wasn't popular. And then you have the Baptists who believe that the Pope is the Antichrist coming along saying, no, we don't believe that papists should be tolerated. And so you see this strong push against them, even from them. I think it's trying to unify against any kind of potential problems that could come up again as it relates to, the papacy and the king, anyone who would take power at that time. They'll want to make sure that they are clear. And then you have Charles II. Charles II wasn't that much different than his predecessor. He wasn't overtly friendly towards Catholics like his father was, but he still used it as a pawn. He still used it to his own advantage. There was even a time where Charles had
offered to become a Roman Catholic as part of a friendship he had with France, but that never seemed to materialize, or I think it was part of an agreement or something. But it just shows you how far these guys are willing to go in order to get what they wanted politically. There is this push to use Roman Catholicism to get whatever they want, even though they were technically head of a church that was substantially and by default opposed to Roman Catholicism. So it just created all this unrest, all this civil unrest, right? It created problems and heartache for the Reform, for our tradition as Baptists, for the broader Reformed community who were trying to establish orthodoxy. And you have Parliament saying one thing over here, and then you have the king doing another thing over here. I mean, that just creates social unrest. It looks bad to your allies and your enemies. I mean, it was just a mess. And so I think the Reform certainly wanted to distance themselves from those things and say, no, that's not who we are. We're not those people. Let's be on the same page of trying to say here. And then you have Charles III. Charles III, the son of Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip. Rising to power in his 70s, I think, with his lover Camilla, where you see this ironic, he's the head of the church, but he's an adulterer, an unrepentant adulterer, and basically an ecumenical fool, because he has no problem as the head of the church tolerating all of these other religions, even though there is a state established church. It's very interesting to see how far England has come from its days where you could go to prison for saying the wrong religious thing, where Baptists were being imprisoned because they weren't going to church in the Church of England, right? Or if you said, like, I think Nehemiah Cox, one of the writers of the 1689, had even he had said basically that the Church of England was an unchristian church, and he got in trouble with the authorities because of that. You just say the wrong thing and you're in trouble, right? That nowadays England is so ecumenical and pragmatic, and now they have such an immigration problem that they're being overrun, that it just doesn't look like the same country that it used to. And we're, the U.S. is starting to look like that in some ways. But I mean, with England, it's a smaller country, smaller people. It's easier. Those things are more noticeable. But it's just interesting to see all of those, how much it's changed. But you have Charles III, who is a pragmatist. He's ecumenical. He's not a true Christian. Wicked life. I mean, just look at what happened with Diane and him back in the 80s and 90s. They were both sleeping around. They were both unhappy. There's no evidence of true faith there. But, as long as you are the monarchy, you represent the church. You're the head of the church. You don't have to live like you're the head of the church, like, holiness or repentance or, any of those things that would actually go with that. You're just by default the head of the church. And I guess you get to determine the theology that's taught. That's something, of course, you have problems there theologically where, you have this king who puts himself in Christ's place. It's kind of ironic, right? The Pope puts himself in Christ's place by being the quote unquote vicar of Christ. But then this king in a supposedly Protestant country puts himself in the place of Christ as the head of the church. So they're both doing this, they're both functioning the wrong way in their roles, right? It's just interesting to see how that plays out. This Protestant country that that wants to act like they're not Rome, and then they still act like Rome in so many ways. And in modern England, especially the Church of England proper, is just a disaster. I mean, now they've named a female archbishop. I mean, that is just unheard in that church's history. Amazing. Uh, Far from where they were. But what you see now is with Charles, you see the the Catholic card is being used. I mean, he's praying with the Pope, right? Or he prayed with the Pope. You're talking about, this isn't just, standing side by side on the street at an abortion clinic with Roman Catholics, which I have done personally before, where you're standing there and you're talking to people on the street, or you're protesting what's going on there. There's Roman Catholics there. Okay, we can unite on the law of nature. We're all united in that. We all should advocate for that. But we're talking about two Protestant and Roman Catholic, diametrically opposed to each other, who are engaging in a religious practice together. That it just frustrates me, and it just shows you that this king has absolutely no idea what he's doing. No idea the ramifications of what he's doing, what he's saying by doing that. He has no idea what the real issues are here, and he has no real care for the things of God. He just doesn't, obviously, as we say, right? But this shows that too. He does not care about the things of God. He is willing to engage in religious practice with a wicked church and do it without blinking, without flinching, not caring at all about the differences. This is somehow this is a false sense of unity, trying to unite these diametrically opposed churches, at least historically, and pretend that's being real Christians and real unity and trying to mend a rift. We don't mend rifts on fundamentals. Okay, we don't do that. We say, here's the line. If you cross it, you better change your mind and fix your foolish thinking. Don't come over here thinking that we're going to get along while you're holding to wicked doctrine, right? Now, that's not to say that the Church of England doesn't have significant and serious issues. But, historically, it's a Protestant church. It's not Roman Catholic. They're diametrically opposed to each other, right? And for us as Christians, we don't compromise on fundamentals, right? We might be able to have joyful disagreement on secondary matters, and we're patient with one another. But on fundamentals, we can't compromise. There is no unity. That's what Nehemiah Cox said to Thomas Collier. I don't know how many times I've quoted that on the show, where he's talking to Thomas Collier and said, there can be basically no communion of saints. There can be no communion of saints until there is agreement on the fundamentals of the Christian religion. There can't be. We can't have unity. We can't fellowship. We can't, because we disagree on the fundamentals. You're not a Christian if you don't agree on the fundamentals. It's simple as that. If you believe in things that are in antithesis and you're obstinate in them, antithesis to the Christian faith at the fundamentals, there is no unity, because you're not a Christian. I can't unify with you. It would be wrong for me to unify with you. What fellowship does Baal have with Christ, right? Do not be unequally yoked. But you see this unequal yoking going on here, right? And I'm not saying the Church of England is a true church. I don't believe it is. I don't believe the Church of England, at least in England proper, is a true church at all. But it's just the principle of the thing, the principle of these two churches that are supposed to be against each other are trying to be ecumenical and unify in a way they shouldn't. And I think this highlights two problems with having, an ecumenical mindset as it relates to, or I'm sorry, not just ecumenical mindset, not ecumenical mindset. I meant to say having a state church, because you are kind of forced to be pragmatic in your approach to things, in how you address these different issues that might arise, different uh, political issues that come up. It's always going to be tied in some way to your job as a ruler, because that is part of your identity as a ruler, right? If you have a state church, part of your identity is to protect that church and to uphold it. So part of your political strategy is also going to be wrapped up in your religious beliefs. That's a problem from a Christian perspective, because it creates a situation where you almost have to be pragmatic in your beliefs in order to be politically pragmatic. There's nothing necessarily wrong about being politically pragmatic, right? Sometimes you have to take a pragmatic approach to have peace, or that might be what's best for your country, in all reason. But if what you're doing politically is tied to what you're doing religiously, and those identities go together, in some way, you're going to have to be pragmatic, if not now, then later, right? And that's, I think, what you see historically with these state churches, especially in England. You see the ebbs and flows of the church going with the political culture, and the political culture is all tied up in those things. And so it goes, all of these, uh, the church and the political mindset tend to go hand in hand. So you have the king, who is really representing the state to the people in a sense, right? And he's doing these religious things. Well, that has an impact on the political sense of that country and how people perceive them politically. So another reason, those things out of each other's lanes, keep them away from each other. Anyways, just some thoughts on these world events that are happening around us. You know, someone might say, well, why do Americans care so much about what's going on in England here? I think it's because it does bring up good lessons, like we're talking about here, or some of the applications, but just from a church history perspective, because we as particular Baptists, and I guess you could say the broader Reformed, unless you're like, a French Reformed or something like that, but at least those who came off of the island, it has significant relevance, because all of these things are related to the things that happened to our forefathers in England in the 17th century. And it kind of highlights that not much has really changed in that, right? These things are still happening. They haven't learned their lesson. I mean, civil wars were started over this. These guys are still going after this pragmatic approach and using Rome for their political ends, despite the fascination. Nothing's changed, and it just highlights the past, right? It's not much different than what's happening now, and it has relevance in that way. So, I hope this is helpful. Kind of a geeky episode a little bit. It went into, we're talking about history, we're talking about these things, in kind of depth, but I hope this is beneficial and gives some food for thought. I love talking about history. I'm a history nerd. You should, if you've listened to the show for a long time, you should know that. I love reading about history, especially history. I like to see why things happen. I like to study wars. There was a time where I took a deep dive into the Vietnam War, and I read, was reading a pretty thick book on it. I like to see why things happen. Why did this conflict happen? Why did this what led to this world event? What were the decisions that were made that led to this happening? Right? That interests me greatly. And I think there's things to be learned from that, because if you can see what caused a conflict, you can see how not to do it again, right? And what did men do? How did they react? Those things fascinate me, especially church history, of course. It's fascinating, but all these things are tied together. But anyways, well, everyone have a great evening. I know we're doing I guess I didn't mention that we're doing this on a Thursday. I have something going on Saturday, so I'm not going to be able to Saturday. But Lord willing, we will be back next week. Everyone take care. Have a great weekend, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you for joining the Particular Baptist Podcast. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at The Particular B and subscribe to us on YouTube, where you can find more of our podcast content. Also, check out our blog at theparticularbaptist.net. And if you'd like to support our ministry, become a patron today at patreon.com/theparticularbaptist.